The city woke on a breath of brine and smoke, its red roofs still damp with night as gulls wheeled like torn scraps of parchment above the masts. Dawn smeared a pale wash across Blackwater Bay, not so much a sunrise as a bruise fading. On the quay, fishwives beat their buckets to call customers, and the carts went rattling by with their wobbling wheels and wicker sides, and the smell of tar and dead crab could have soured milk. A girl in a torn gray cloak stood with her back to a leaning pile of rope and watched all of it as if the world were a thing she could bite. She held her jaw set, the way you bite the inside of your cheek to stop a sound escaping. She did not think of herself as a girl. She did not think of herself as anything but small and quick and hungry. Names were things you took off and folded away when they made you seem. Once she had been Arya of Winterfell, but she said that name now only inside the cave of her skull, where it could echo without being heard. She had been cat and weasel and airy, and sometimes, if no one listened, she was only a breath that moved between one hiding place and another, the shape of a thought that bent around corners. She had thought never to come back here, never to set foot on these stones again, not on this hill that had watched with its cold eyes while her father bled. Yet there the red keep stood, rose-red above Aegon's high hill, its towers thrusting up like fingers, its banners heavy with morning stillness. Wind shifted and a white lion on crimson shivered awake, long tail curving. Her tongue went dry. The steps where it had happened were far from the quays, but she could feel the city's memory of it the way you might feel a scar on your own body when rain began. The old wound in her chest pressed down. She swallowed and tasted salt that had nothing to do with the sea. She touched the hilt hidden in her sleeve, the small, thin thing she had coaxed from a gullible knife boy 2 nights past with a lie about a brother who worked the ovens. Bone handle polished by a dozen kitchen fingers, blade thin as a thought, long enough to slip and vanish. Not needle. Needle was something else, iron and memory and a word she could not say aloud without feeling her throat ache. But this would serve. Are you buying or staring? A fishwife snapped, slapping the tail of a gray fish against the board so its dead eye flashed. The girl blinked, looked at the coin she didn't have, looked at the fish, at the mouth that would never close again. A cat crept along the quay's edge and watched her with a contempt so perfect it felt civilized. I'm not hungry, the girl said. It was almost true. Hunger was a clean edge inside her, and she had learned how to lean against it. The fishwife snorted and turned, shouting at a boy that if he pinched one more cockle, she'd use his ear to measure out the rest. Sun shook itself free of a low rag of cloud and lit the red keep's walls a ruddy gold. A wagon rolled by with sacks of barley stacked high and a pair of plodding donkeys switching their tails as if bored. 2 men walked at its side, red cloaks pushed back to their shoulders and helms under their arms. Their talk was careless, the talk of men who believed a whole city was their floor and their roof and their cup to drink from. The girl watched the wheels. She watched how they cut the ruts. She watched where they would climb. When the wagon labored toward the hill, she went with it, not behind but slantwise, loose as a stray dog that might be following nothing but a scent it had invented. The road to the hill was always steeper than you remembered, its dust mixed with old blood and old ashes and spilled wine. The girl kept her head down and her shoulders rounded, yet she saw everything. She saw the shoemaker stooping to lift his shutter and the fat man spitting with an air of ceremony into the gutter and the woman in green with a child on her hip who stared at the red cloaks as if counting. She saw a boy scratching his name with a nail into a doorpost and a priest of some mean god or other lifting a shard of mirror to admire his own zeal. The city talked to itself and pretended not to listen. At the king's gate, the donkeys balked. One man cursed and yanked the leading rein. The other laughed and then stopped laughing when a gold cloak gave him a long look through the bars of the visor. Helmets gleamed, pikes stood slanted, and the shadows of the battlements lay sharp and black like slices cut by a careful knife. Barley for the royal ovens, the laughing man said with the grunt of someone who had had to say the same thing every day for a fortnight. The guard peered beneath the tarp, poked a sack, released the wagon with a nod that believed itself important. The girl was already moving. She took 3 steps to match the donkey's 3, pivoted, set one hand on the back rail as if steadying herself, and swung into the space between sacks with the laziness of a cat finding a lap. Barley rasped against her cheek as she slid into a burr-scented hollow. Dust filled her throat until she had to bite her knuckles to keep from coughing. The wood creaked above her and the world tilted with the climb. Through a slit in the piled sacks, she saw the sky become a narrow blue knife and the towers loom, stone piling on stone until she had to look away or feel crushed. She counted because counting was a rope across a river. 7 heartbeats, then 7 again. In between, she made her mouth move silently. Joffrey, Cersei, Island, Meryn, Polliver, the mountain. Names like knots on a string. She did not let her tongue shape the hound. Sometimes at night, her mind added him. In the day, she rubbed the name flat with other thoughts the way you rub a stain with spit and a thumb. The wagon's jolts became the even thrum of stone. They had passed beneath the gatehouse. She felt the shade settle like a hand on her head. Shouts, a dog bark, the ring of something iron dropped and picked up again with vexation. She kept still. A grain found the corner of her eye and lodged there, and she could not lift a hand to brush it away. Her breath made a hot pocket that smelled of barley and damp wood and herself. She thought of the first time she had breathed like that, in a dark hole behind a statue while her father walked out to meet the thing that had already decided itself. She thought of the feathered scream of the crowd and the way Yoren's hand had been iron around her neck as he pulled her away. The memory was a metal taste at the back of her tongue. She swallowed it. The wagon stopped with a final grinding bump. Voices, men's voices, a woman's laughter like the clatter of lids. The tarp above her rustled. A rectangle of light appeared and swung, and in its brief brightness the dust became a world of its own. Specks tumbling like thoughts a person might never be rid of. Right then, said a voice, and sacks shifted, the space around her tightening and then opening crumb by crumb. She clung with the easy terror of someone who could dwell here a long time if she must. The men tugged until they had a gap big enough to work through, dragged sacks down, grunting and swearing companionably. When the opening was wide enough that a child's shoulder might fit, she slid like poured water, and now she was not a child but a shadow between bulk and wall, then a shadow between 2 barrels of pickled something. The air here was flavored with onions and tallow and the flat sour of old beer. She lay a moment, feeling the stones grit through her cloak. Then she was up, moving, the kitchen's noises guiding her. The hiss of fat, the drum of a cleaver, the rhythm of orders batted about like shuttlecocks. She knew kitchens. A kitchen is a mouth that feeds a palace, and mouths do not see what goes between their teeth. She went to the side wall where brooms leaned and took one up as if it were hers, the big straw head hiding the small hand that held it. She set it to moving. So long as something in your hand looked like work, you were work. Steam made the air soft. The cooks barked without looking. On the far table, a boy her age scaled a heap of river fish that still wore the slime of their last wet. A woman with wrists like hem tied strings of sausages, the casings hissing as they slid from their horn. Voices in the dialect of the kitchens, a language of cuts and times, of where's the salt gone? And that's not salt, that's sugar, God's curse you. The girl moved under it, her broom making narrow paths between the spit boys and the scullions lugging pails. Once a bucket sloshed and wet her hem with greasy water. She stood until the boy had gone and then stepped away, patient as a stone in a rainstorm. When eyes found her, they saw what they expected. A mouse thing, a scullion, nobody's daughter. This one's new, said a woman with a face like a spoon. She hooked the girl's chin with a floury forefinger and turned her face left and right. Got teeth. The girl opened her mouth to show the ones that remained. Knows how to close it too, the woman said. Good. She pushed a wooden bowl into the girl's hands. Scraps. Don't pick. You steal, I'll set the dogs on you. Yes, the girl said. She made her eyes big the way she'd seen younger girls do. She did not say thank you. Gratitude was another of those things that made you seen. She took the bowl to a corner and ate with her fingers, bread heel soaked in gravy, a few shreds of meat no one would miss, a carrot that had gone soft at one end. She ate without hurry, the way you eat when you have taught yourself that meals can be knives, too. The scrape of Spoon Woman's voice went over her head and away. The world of the kitchen rose and fell around her. A boy yelped when his finger met a blade. Someone laughed. A dog sneezed. In the days that followed, she learned the cast of the place as a rat learns the floorboards. She learned when the meat carts came and the manner of the butcher with his bluish hands. She learned that the ovens had a way of breathing like beasts asleep, and that the girl who scrubbed pots wept silently and often. She learned that 3 men in white cloaks came to the buttery after noon most days, took wine down their throats as if it were medicine, and left without looking at who had poured. Their faces were different, but the set of the jaw was the same. Men who had put their faces away. She learned that a dwarf came once in a while, with a scar that cut his face like a river carved a valley, and that when he came the kitchens tried to be quieter and failed. The keep above the kitchens was a tree whose roots she knew. It had halls like trunks and branches, rooms like knots, corridors like the veins in a leaf. It had shortcuts you found because you could fit where men could not. It had guards who believed their own feet enough. Rats had left trails long before her. Once, when she pressed herself into a slit in the stone where mortar had fallen and a tapestry's edge tickled her ear, she smelled a draft that had no place to come from, cool breath on the back of her neck. She closed her eyes and let it tell her a direction. Later, she found the seam. It was not a door, not quite. It opened for fingers that pried and a weight that knew how much a stone wanted to move. Beyond it lay a crawl space of old dust and the coffin smell of dead mortar. She slid along its length and found 2 other mouths, one that breathed in a servant's hallway and one that coughed its stale air into a wardrobe of forgotten blankets. This was a good thing. You could live your whole life under a house if you knew the right mouseways. At night, when the fires died down and the pots were scoured and the last bone thrown to the kennel, she lay on the pallet the spoon-faced woman gave her and recited in the dark where words came true. Joffrey. The name itself was a taste, spoiled wine. She might have said it 100 times and it would not be empty. The others were rocks that made a river sing when the water ran fast. Sometimes between names her mind replaced them with faces. Her father's face was always in pieces, as if her memory's fingers could not hold it together because they were slick with fear. Sometimes she made herself see him whole. That hurt more. She did not always sleep. Sleep was a pool where the past lives like a snake. In those hours, she moved the blade from its hiding place to another and then to another again, because it soothed her to make a map only she knew. Once she saw her sister, not near enough to touch, but near enough to taste the distance like rain coming. It was a morning after rain when the stones steamed and the leaves in the small garden wore pearl drops. The girl was carrying a basket of turnips because there is nothing you can do with turnips but carry them and hope the day finds them useful. And she took a wrong turn that was not wrong because she had made it so. And she found herself at the edge of a little court with a quince tree at its center and a bench of carved stone that had something half-worn and soft about its edges, as if it had been sat upon by women whose names mattered to someone once. Sansa sat with 2 other ladies, a bit apart in that way that made a shape of loneliness even in company. A maid and a guard stood where a maid and a guard always stood, not to hear, only to be. Sansa's hair was coiled and shone. Her hands were folded like something taught to kneel. She was speaking low and the others leaned toward her, their sighs soft as moth wings. The girl did not try to see Sansa's eyes. She knew if she did her own face would come off and she could not afford to be a face. She counted 3 heartbeats and went away and did not go back for many days. If Sansa had known, what would that look have been? Relief? Terror? The little sharp smile she had worn as a tiny girl when she had a secret sweep? The thought was a thread she refused to pull. She could not mend 2 lives at once. The king's voice found her before the king did. Voices make shape, even to someone who has not much listened to voices except to know the difference between a man who will strike and a man who will not. Joffrey's voice had the thin brightness of a blade that had been sharpened too much and wanted to chip. She heard it first from the far end of the throne room, hiding in a gap where a pillar's foot did not quite meet the wall. He was railing about something, the cost of pepper, perhaps, or the way a messenger had bowed too slowly, and his words ran so hot they melted as they fell. He liked to say a thing twice. Sometimes what he liked to say was his own name. The girl watched a line of courtiers bend and straighten in the sun that fell like bars across the floor and thought of the yard at Winterfell when the boys had practiced with wooden swords. Joffrey liked to watch himself move. You could hear it in the way he laughed at his own wit. She marked his times. He took the yard in the mornings when the heat made sweat an enemy. In the afternoons he went to the mews. A king's hawks study a king and teach him nothing. A king studies a hawk and learns how to be cruel with grace. His guards changed with the clock in a rhythm that would have pleased a dancer. One of the white cloaks wore his boredom like a cloak over his cloak. Another had eyes that drifted to women's throats. Another had a scar that made his mouth look thoughtful when he was not. She learned which one was called Marin without anyone saying it. The name slotted into the place in her head where prayer went. Once, when she took a picture through a side door that breathed the smell of sun-warmed stone and oiled leather, she saw Joffrey closer than she had ever seen him. He walked with his mother and a woman whose smile held too much patience to be mere pleasure. The king wore yellow, a shade that made him seem made of wax. He moved like someone whose feet believed the ground should love them. His hair held the light as if it had decided the light belonged to it. The girl made herself small enough that if he walked through her, she would not resist. He did not look. His mother did. The queen's eyes were wine that had been watered and still made you sleep if you drank much. They swept the girl and passed on. The other woman, Marjorie, the kitchen said in the tone people use when naming something new and bright that might be their future. Looked too, and her glance had a softness that made the girl want to bite it. She tilted the pitcher and let water run out onto the flagstones beside a potted laurel until the spill looked like an accident. Felt like something else. In the mews, the hawks had their dark patience. The earthy sweetness of hay and the sleep breath of dovecots pressed the air. You could hear the leather creak and the soft knock of jesses against perches and the sudden bang when wings spoke. Joffrey liked to stand with his arm cased and his hand flat as if offering the world as a platform. His face when the hawk came was the face of a boy pleased because something finer than him had chosen to come near. It made him gentle by accident. He spoke to the hawk in a voice that made even the leather whisper seem loud. He did not know he could be kind when no one watched. The girl watched and did not forgive him for it. The plan, when it came, did not feel like a plan. It felt like a door in a wall that had been there all along. There are times in a life when the world seems to lean in your direction and say, if now, now. The spoon-faced woman, her name was Hale, she had told the girl one noon when the kitchen slept and hands were idle, would be gone that evening to see a sister who had a boil the size of an egg and wanted it admired. The white cloak with the thoughtful scar would be on the wall walk, not at the mews. The boy with the lure, a string of feathers intended to lie to a hawk, had a cough that kept him to his palate. The sun had spent itself on a day so hard-working even the flies seemed sated. The city settled in its heat. It was the hour when doors are left on the latch because who would have the energy to creep when the air itself is your weight? She went as if to fetch something she had not been asked to fetch. She went with a coil of rope at her waist because there is nothing suspicious about rope in a place that must tie 100 things a day. She went with her sleeves rolled high so her arms were only a girl's arms. She went with the blade hidden down the inside of her left forearm, its grip tucked into the crook of her elbow, held by cloth and by the stubbornness of not letting go. Her feet were as she had taught them, quiet without pretending to be. Feet that look like they try not to make noise make more noise than they must. Feet that know the floor is a friend do best. She knew the floor now. It gave back to her only as much as she took from it. Near the mews, a cat slept turning itself in a curl, its ear a scrap of parchment folded and refold. It opened one green eye as she passed and closed it, making an allowance. The door stood propped, the wood swollen in its frame with the day's heat. Inside, the shadow smelled of feathers, of straw sweet with old sun, of leather's false life. A stable boy picked at a blister and glanced up and said, "What?" Because boys say that when they do not know what else to say and would rather not be the ones to speak. Hale wants the small lure mended. The girl lied. The kind of lie that wears someone else's name so it does not sit too awkwardly. She pointed at a shelf. The boy nodded, relieved to have the world make sense again. and went back to peeling at his hand. The hawks shifted. One made a sound almost like speech and made the hair rise along the girl's arms. She moved past them, and the light that fell in a lattice through the high windows made her a creature wit. Bars across her. It did not matter. She had been behind bars before, and alive was alive. Voices outside were a blur, then closer. The laugh came first, that thin blade-bright sound. The king entered with 2 white cloaks and a boy with a hooded bird. The boy's cough rattled. So he had come after all. The universe is always making new minds from old facts. The girl stepped backward into shadow. The king liked to take a path he had taken before. She had seen him count his own steps once, the way a child at a game counts the cracks in the floor. 3rd pillar, stand, left hand raised. Say something about boldness to men who have no use for boldness except to feign it. He did not look left on the 2nd step. He never had. That offered her a space just wide enough to fit. Again, Joffrey said. The boy with the hooded hawk stumbled and the bird twitched, hood bumping, leather creaking. The king's mouth pinched. Not like a fishwife, he said more sharply, and one of the white cloaks snorted, then swallowed the sound. The other watched with a boredom so heavy it bent his shoulders. When he shifted, his armor whined softly, old leather speaking to new metal. The lure swung and the hawk sprang, a sudden machine of grace, its wings beating the air into a new shape. The rush of it filled the mews, a sound like 100 soft hands clapping. Joffrey's face opened. He extended his arm and the bird came like a blessing, and his mouth softened at the corners, and the world was for a moment not a court, not a plan, not anything but the mathematics of flight fulfilled. Majesty, said the bored white cloak, it will do for today. I will decide what it does, Joffrey said, and the thin blade of his voice tried to cut the other and failed. He stroked the bird's breast with his free hand, and the hawk closed its eyes with the pleased arrogance of a thing designed too well to care who held it. Joffrey smiled, and for a breath he was very young. The girl had to put her teeth into the inside of her cheek again to feel something simple. The boy with the cough doubled over. The hawk ruffled, shifted. The white cloak with the boredom turned his head half a hand's breadth toward the doorway, the way a man will when he thinks how far it is to his supper. The other white cloak took a step to peer up at a rafter where something had made a tiny noise, perhaps only a twig settling. Joffrey's attention followed the white cloak's eyes for a stitched-out heartbeat, but his arm stayed steady with its leather sleeve and its gauntlet. He had practiced that steadiness, perhaps often. The girl moved. It did not look like moving. It looked like shadow changing shape. She came in a slide, her hips never bumping wood, her shoulder rolling so her arm came loose from her body like a small animal unpeeling from a place it had slept. The blade slipped from its cloth nest and lay along her palm. She felt how sharp it was in the way it did not hesitate to be itself. It was cool because she was not. Joffrey's left side was toward her, leather thick on his forearm, linen fine beneath his tunic. Between ribs there is always a place that asks to be found. You can locate it with fingers or with a thought if you have lived with hunger long enough. Her father had told her not to be cruel for sport. Her dancing master had told her to see with her feet. No one had told her how one moment becomes two. She did not whisper the list. She did not say anything at all. She slid the blade in under his ribs the way you might slip a letter into a place it is meant to be kept secret. It went in easier than she expected because the body believes in opening. His breath caught and became a different thing. A small, astonished sound as if he had found a new taste he could not name. The hawk flung itself from his settled hand because hands become other things when they are hurt. Its wings struck her cheek with a solid beat and left the smell of dust and bird and wild air. The boy with the cough stared. The bored white cloak turned and needed an instant to understand the world had altered while he had looked away. In that instant, the girl had already taken one step backward, the blade withdrawing like a thought you decide not to say after all. Joffrey made a shape with his mouth that had nothing to do with words. He had lips like a child's still. His eyes jumped to her face. She had not intended to let him see her. Something in her wanted him to know. Something in her did not. She did not know which of those somethings would have the victory as her life went on. It did not matter because the choice had already been made. He saw a girl, small and brown and fiercely intent the way a candle is. He saw nothing else because he had not trained himself to see anything that looked like a servant. He lifted his hand as if to touch where she was and found that there was a gauntlet and that it felt too heavy. Then the weight of his body remembered itself and pulled him down. His knees went first. The hawk hit a beam above with a skitter and a complaint and clung, flexing, glancing with the cold regard of birds, as if all of this were less interesting than a mouse's track in snow it had never seen. The muse breathed once in silence, and then men began. The white cloak, whose boredom had been his whole personality, drew his sword and shouted something that was both heresy and prayer. The other leapt forward, as if leaping were a spell that could turn time back. The boy with the cough bent to the king and made a mistake. He touched. The body on the ground had been king and was now only a young thing that weighed more than its bones. It was surprising always how bodies weigh what they weigh when they are not actively doing anything with themselves. The boy made a sound, and then another that was the boy calling for his mother in a voice he had not used in 10 years. The hawk, offended by this display of poor behavior, tried to take off and discovered it was still tethered. It flapped, beat the air, flapped. The girl had moved again, shadow into shadow. She left the blade in the space between pillar and wall and pulled the cloth after it, tying 2 knots with fingers that had tied 100 knots in the kitchens and whose memory of rope had nothing to do with murder. She stepped through the narrow door into the passage used by men who brought in barrels of straw, and she was gone from the muse before the second white cloak had hit his knees and cried to know God by name. The passage was a friend. It did not ask questions. It smelled of straw that had been damp last winter and dried at last and now was only a little sour. Her heart did not pound. It moved with precision, as if it had trained for this run for years without telling her. Outside, the court stretched in hot evening. The light had gone to honey and lengthened everything. She walked, not ran. Running is a declaration. Walking is a lie the ground tells for you. 2 serving men passed and glanced at her and then passed her because a girl carrying a coil of rope is not an event. From a window above, a woman laughed, a brief, bright, cruel sound that had been trained to sound like relief. A dog scratched itself as if the day were just an itch at last. Bells began. She knew the tone of alarm bells and the tone of ceremony bells and the tone of bells rung for the fun of it by a boy who had stolen a rope. This was none of those. This was the bell people ring when something happens that cannot have happened. It was thin and wild. It came from more than one tower, cascading, and the echo ran down the hill and into the city and was chewed to pieces by the streets and spat back as rumor. She did not hurry. Hale would be back by now, telling of her sister's boil with the relish of one who pretends to be appalled. The ovens would be cooling. The scullions would be sitting with their backs to the wall and their feet extended and the space between them full of talk. If she walked in then, she would be part of the wall again. In the long passage that turned toward the servants' courtyard, a tall shadow detached itself from the larger shadow of a pillar and became a man. He moved with the matter-of-fact grace of someone who had worn armor so long that even without it his body remembered. He smelled like horse always, even if he had not been near one for a day. A pale scar ran the length of his face like a road that had given up being a road halfway through. His eyes were a gray that had lost interest in being a color. He had a habit of aiming his head at the world like a spear. The hound looked at her as if his gaze could peel her from her place. He did not know her. Why would he? He had seen a boy once with hair hacked rough, a child with a wooden sword and a mouth that would not stay shut. He had seen 1,000 small things in a city that shed them every day like skins. He looked now only because the air was wrong, and he was a man who had learned to smell wrongness like a wolf. The bells were clamoring. His hand flexed near where a sword would be, then stilled. He looked at the coil of rope at her waist. He looked at her eyes. She made her eyes a place without interest. "What's the noise?" he said, as if the city were a dog that had begun to bark and ought to be cuffed. "I don't know," she said, and let her voice be dull with kitchen hours. It was not a lie. She did not know what the bells named, only that she did. His eyes flicked, weighing the tone as a man who buys wine weighs whether the cellar has watered it. He grunted and moved on, long stride taking him with a particular impatience, the impatience of a man who expects stupidity at every step and is too tired to be charmed by his own rightness. She walked after him 2 breaths and then turned into her own smaller hall where a spilled bucket had left a map of the world in a brown puddle. In the kitchens, the noise was a stew of fear and appetite. "What's it for?" Hale demanded, as if anyone would keep such a thing from her on purpose. "What is it for?" "Something at the Mews," someone said. "No, it was in the yard." "No, in the throne room." "No, the Queen's cat had kittens in the wrong place." "No, it's—" The boy who brought water from the court burst in, out of breath. "The king," he said, and then could not say anything else because the need to breathe is a law older than kings. The room went very quiet. The fires talked to themselves. "What about the king?" Hale asked, her voice strange, as if she had thrown it across the room and hoped it would land. "Dead," the boy said, and then he seemed to hear the word and clap a hand to his mouth as if to keep more like it from falling out. "They're saying it," he added, as if that rescued him from making the statement himself. "They're saying it like it's true." Someone began to laugh and put their hands over their own mouth. Someone else dropped a ladle and then stood on it and hopped with more surprise than pain. Hale said a word the girl had never heard and then crossed herself in a manner that tried to cover too many gods at once. The room found a new pitch of talking. In it, the girl sat with the bowl of turnip peelings and watched the rim very steadily as if it told a future. The bells did not stop. They changed, running up a hill of notes they had not climbed since the battle. Above, the castle threw voices in every direction. The change of air that movement makes found the kitchen and stirred the smell of onions into new shapes. The girl took up a rag and wiped a clean spot for the sake of doing something. Her hands shook because she would not allow anything else to. Her heart stayed sensible. After a time, a man darkened the doorway who could make silence happen in rooms where he had never stood. He was small, but his steps did not apologize for it. His face bore a new scar. Men look like their scars when they are tired. He took in the kitchen without obviously looking and said, "Wine." Hale moved before the word had settled and brought it. Tyrion Lannister drank, not as if he loved wine, but as if his throat were a passage the world must go through whether it wished to or not. He wiped his mouth on his sleeve like a man in a field, not a lord. He looked at their faces as if he were reading a ledger that kept rewriting itself. "You have heard," he said. "Of course you have. The keep hears before the bells finish ringing. Listen to me now. Anyone who sees anything that he does not usually see, anyone who hears a tale that runs faster than its legs ought, anyone who finds the smallest thing where it ought not be, say so. There are times for keeping your head down and times for looking." He glanced at the girl for the briefest instant, perhaps because she was the smallest thing in the room. His eyes were a cleaver chopping truth from rumor. She made her expression stupid, the way you might make your penmanship ugly so a teacher will stop pointing at you. "The Queen?" Hale asked. Her voice had dried to a husk. "The Queen will." "She will," Tyrion said wearily, not completing the thought. He lifted the cup again. "Everyone will." He set it down without finishing and walked away. The kitchen breathed without speaking until his step had gone. Cersei Lannister's grief had edges. It cut the corridors and left a particular smell behind it, as if lavender had been trampled into the stone. It came like weather, not a person's mood but the city's, so that men lifted their heads and then ducked them without knowing why. The girl felt it pass like a storm that blesses one field and ruins another. Somewhere Sansa's hands had finally come unclasped and then clasped again, not knowing which was the right prayer now. Somewhere, the Tyrell girl stood with her aunt and measured what it is to be promised one thing and offered another. Somewhere, Littlefinger leaned with his back to a wall that had rememberings in it and smiled at nothing. And Varys went silent in the particular way that means a man has begun to think so hard he might forget how to breathe. The Hound went places he did not usually go. He walked the mews and saw blood on straw and cursed because straw was hard to clean. He stood in a doorway and listened to 3 white cloaks argue which of their failures was the most decorated. He went to the yard and watched men practice with blunted swords and did not correct them because he did not care if they broke their own toes. He looked at the city below and felt its teeth. He drank and then stopped because the wine in King's Landing always tasted like an insult someone had paid you to accept. The girl cleaned and listened and kept her head bowed when men with questions came to ask them. A gold cloak with a lip like a slash made her name herself twice. She said, "Cat." He wrote it down, perhaps because writing it down made it seem less ridiculous. He peered into her face and saw only kitchen smoke and fear that looks like resignation. He went away to find someone who would give him a better story. In the night, she woke and sat with her knees under her chin and pressed her knuckles to her teeth, so she would not make the sound that wanted to make itself. She had thought there would be a moment like in the stories when you lift your head and understand the world has changed because of a thing you have done. There was no such moment. The world had changed and also it had not. Men still shouted at boys to bring water faster. A fire still needed feeding or it would die. Her belly still hurt the way it hurt when you had eaten enough but not much. She put her hand over her heart. It beat. She thought of her father and the feeling when you open a door and there is no one on the other side because the other side was a long time ago. She thought of Joffrey's eyes, their surprise, how there had been no plea in them. He had not believed he could need to ask. She had thought she might feel triumph. She felt like a person who had held her breath too long and now could not decide whether to laugh or cough. In that space, a small heartbeat formed. You could plant such a seed in your heart and see what it grew to. She did not know yet. She curled around it and slept. The city had a way of making what happened into story before the sun rose twice. By the next evening, there were 3 versions that had already hardened. In one, an assassin from the free cities had come like smoke through a keyhole and vanished the same way, leaving behind a feather. In another, a jealous man of the Kingsguard had done it in a fit and then bitten his own tongue out to keep from speaking. In a third, the gods had reached down because they had tired of a boy who had misused the toys of power. The girl listened as if to songs in a language she did not own. She knew how stories work. They are nets thrown across the water to give shape to what does not want shape. She kept her hands at her sides. Sansa kept to her rooms at first. A woman who had mothered her with a patience that made mockery of gentleness smoothed her hair and set tea where tea belongs when the world insists on ceremony. Sansa looked at her hands and did not remember when last she had washed them or whether that mattered. Her mind made a list without meaning it to. The curve of Joffrey's mouth when he had spoken kindness in front of people. The way he had let a thing that had been precious to her fall as if to test gravity. The blue of the winter sky she had stared into on the day she had been told to go walking with him. The line of light along a shelf in her room where dust gathered in peace because no one could reach it. She thought, as if through cloth, what does it mean that a thing I wanted not to happen has happened without my wanting? She pressed her tongue to the roof of her mouth until she tasted iron. The way Arya had always done when she was about to throw herself into trouble. She had not meant to think of Arya. When she did, a part of her that had been a tight knot loosened as if in relief and tightened again at once for safety. She stared at the tea and did not drink. The bells had stopped. The silence rang. Cersei moved like a storm that has decided to choose its path by will alone. Her face had become the kind of beautiful that frightens dogs. She spoke to people as if each were flint and she had a spark to strike from them whether they had spark left or no. She called for the Kingsguard and dismissed them and then called again because the act of calling them and sending them away soothed something inside her that needed to be soothed. She summoned her father in her mind 100 times and cursed him the 101st because he had not materialized from air to hold the world in place. She said the word vengeance in a voice that had never said please. She stood at a window and watched the city arrange itself as if it could be arranged. Once she pressed her palm to the cold stone and did not cry. She had cried when she had been 12 and it had done nothing. The memory enraged her in a clean, simple way. If she had had a sword, she might have used it herself. She had no sword. She had voices and the understanding that voices are weapons if you aim them properly. Tyrion moved in the spaces between such storms. He ordered, and his orders were mostly obeyed. He heard and judged and discarded and kept. He stood in the mews and felt the straw under his boots and the iron stink clinging to it, and closed his eyes for a heartbeat because he could not think and breathe and smell that at once. He knelt because no one else was looking and touched the dark patch where the king had bled and felt the straw prick his skin through his calluses. He thought of the time a book had slipped from his lap and fallen face down. That was a stupid thought. He knew it and let it remain because the mind does not take orders well. He opened his eyes and looked for facts. A coil of cloth near a pillar with 2 knots in it told him something about hands, about someone who had used rope for long days. The angle of the blood told him something about surprise. The lack of any shouted name in the witnesses told him something about speed. He did not say any of this aloud. He let it sit in him and rot into truth. The hound went to the wall. He looked out over the city where rumor ran like fire in dry cane. Blackwater lay like a piece of beaten metal, hammered and hammered again by the sun. He had never much loved the boy. He had loved his job because jobs give shape. He ran a hand over his jaw and felt stubble rasp. He spat, fell far. Good, he said, perhaps to the air, perhaps to the part of himself that had hoped. Then he remembered a girl with a mouth like a door left open in a storm. He scowled at the thought and scrubbed it away with a curse. Children and kings. The world had too many of both. The girl in the kitchen watched a fly walk the rim of a cup and wondered why the sight of it made her chest ache. She had done the thing. It sat inside her like a stone with frost on it. It made the air seem too bright. It made food seem a joke and then made the joke funny again because living is a petty insistence. She peeled potatoes with a short knife that had a nick in its blade and thought of apples in the Winterfell orchard. How the trees had made a green room. How you could hide between them and still hear your own laughter as a separate thing in the leaves. She did not let herself look at the door. Looking at a door makes it suspect you intend to use it. That night, after the noise had gone tired, she slipped to the seam she had found and worked the stone and slid into the old bones of the keep. Dust rose in soft astonishment and settled on her lashes. She moved in a crouch, hands forward, feeling the air with her knuckles. She had stashed a satchel here 2 days ago because you don't leave your leaving to the day you need to leave. In it were 2 stale rolls wrapped in cloth, a water skin with a plug that fit too tight, a shirt that would pass for a boy's, a little coin sewn into the hem and forgotten until you could afford to remember. She took the satchel and its weight settled into her shoulders as if it had always been meant to belong there. She closed the stone and made sure it sat like ordinary stone. She put her cheek to it as if to a friend. It had that old warmth stone keeps long after the day has ended. If a man had followed, he would have seen a small figure step out of the wall's mouth in a servant's passage that meant to go nowhere and yet had wandered all over the castle in its life, and he would have seen her pass along the shadowed length like a memory refusing to become story. No one followed. The gods of small things watched her as they watch ants find the crack between stone and go about their business. She went to the kitchens one last time, to the door that led to the yard where the midden stood in righteous stench and the pig boy cursed without creativity. She stood and breathed the smell in case she missed it later. It would be silly to miss it. She missed it anyway. She left by a gate that had not been meant for leaving but had learned how to be. It let refuse out, usually, and it let her out now because the world is very movable if you are small enough. A gold cloak leaned and yawned. She walked by with a bucket and did not look to see whether he looked. When she was in the alley, no longer hairbreadths from blades and lions and women with eyes like watered wine, she sighed without knowing she meant to sigh and felt her shoulders drop. She did not stop walking. The city at night is not a thing that waits politely for you to gather yourself. She slid into its black mouth like a seed spit into furrowed ground. Flea Bottom took her into itself with a shrug. The heat had not left. It had simply settled lower, in the alleys where men slept on rope beds and women laughed too loud and children ran with a fervor that looked like worship. Cooking fires guttered. Someone sang about a woman who had ruined a man with nothing but her ankles. Rats had their own business. The girl's feet knew this part of the city better than the hill. She found a door that would open to a certain knock and slid into a room that had other motionless bodies in it and lay down on a pallet that had remembered 100 spines and leaked their dreams. She put her hand under her head and tucked the satchel between her legs. She kept her blade where her hand could find it without looking. She closed her eyes and saw a hawk's wing, the arc and beat of it, the way it had brought the air with it. She slept because not sleeping is a way of dying craftily. In the morning, the city had picked a story firmly enough to be wrong. It would take days to whittle wrongness down to a shape that resembled the thing. Trade found its steps again because trade always does, and two men could be heard at the mud gate arguing over the price of eels, as if nothing had happened that would change the meals of kings and beggars both. A cart broke a wheel at the fishmonger's square, and the curse that followed it was a familiar prayer. The keep still rose, red and arrogant, and the flag still believed wind to be their personal audience. The girl wrapped her hair tight under a cap and walked as one of the 100 small boys who run errands for people who will not listen even when spoken to 3 times. She became the color of the street. She listened to what the street said back into itself. Word came like birds that had been aloft all night and only now found perches. The Tyrells had shut their doors and opened them again and sent for flowers, as if the smell of roses could shoulder out the smell of blood. The queen had called for the heads of every ratcatcher in the city, and then thought better and called for the head of whoever had told her to call for ratcatchers. The dwarf had not slept. The hound had smiled and then not smiled and had hit a man who had said a thing too loudly. Somewhere, behind closed doors, a boy who had been a shadow of a brother polished a crown. He was not sure fit any person who could wear it without stumbling. The girl did not think of crowns. She thought of the river, how it lay beyond the piers, how it could take a person away if the person had the coin to ask and the courage to go where the water forgot to be gentle. She went once more to the hill. It was stupid. Stupid is a word that has limits until you push them. She went because a part of her saw the shape of the world better from high places. She went because there was one face she had not seen since the sound of bells, and it lived somewhere behind stone and breath and fear. She went because you do hard things for love, and sometimes you do stupid things for the same reason and make them into one hard stupid thing that does not ask your permission. She carried a basket of folded linen because linen stands as explanation in a place that thinks itself clean. She climbed and let the weight of the basket be the weight of her fear so the ladder could seem lighter. At the gate, a guard with a head too small for his shoulders squinted as if the world were a bright thing he only tolerated. "Linen," she said, and gave him the look of a person who had been told all her life what to do and agreed to do it. He waved her through because plagues begin with such waves. Inside, the keep stones felt different. They had always had secrets. Now they wore the knowledge of a death. The corridors went tight with urgency and then slack with shock and then tight again. The girl walked a path she had taught her feet when her mind had been too busy to teach itself anything. At a corner where a little niche held a statue of a woman without hands, she stopped because stopping is sometimes safer than keeping going. Voices came like water around a rock. 2 men spoke in low tones meant to seem quieter than quiet. "If the city believes the gods did it, we cannot hang gods," one said. "If the city believes a sellsword did it, we can find a sellsword to hang. If the city believes a..." The other interrupted with a huff that said his patience was too expensive to waste on words like sellsword. The girl let them pass and looked the statue in the face. The woman without hands looked back as if she understood how a person could be more dangerous for lacking a thing. Sansa was in the small garden again. The quince tree had lost a few leaves to the evening earlier, and they lay like coins around its trunk. She sat and did not touch the hands she had folded so carefully because the task of keeping them folded was the only task that would not break her. A maid had been dismissed. A guard stood at a distance that had been judged appropriate by someone who had never sat with grief. The girl came to the archway and paused long enough to become part of it. She waited until the wind lifted the strip of her hair that had escaped the cap. She waited until Sansa's eyes, restless from holding stillness too long, found motion and raised themselves and met hers. They did not change. That was a kind of miracle. If love is the knowledge of a person in a shape they have not yet had time to take, there is also the other thing, the flinty acknowledgement of seeing someone you have known come into a face you could have recognized in the womb. Sansa's eyes did not widen or fill or go to pieces. They widened a little perhaps because eyes do widen when they belong to a body that has just learned a thing, and then they did something else. They warmed as if someone had lit a taper in a cold church. Her mouth did not open. Her hands did not unfold. She looked down at her folded hands and then looked up again. The girl lifted her chin a quarter of an inch the way wolves do. Sansa's mouth trembled and then steadied. Very softly, so softly even the wind could not carry it to indiscreet leaves. Sansa said, "Arya?" The girl stood a heartbeat too long and then nodded once, a movement that might have been a twitch if seen by anyone who did not wish to call it anything. She stepped under the arch. The guard did not stir because the world teaches certain men that women in gardens do nothing except sit and grow. The girl came and stood before the bench as if she were going to list the linens she had brought and where they might be put for best convenience. Her throat was dry as a shelf. She said nothing because words are snares. Sansa's eyes had known how to be kind since she was small, and they were kind now, but the kindness had steel in it. "Are you hurt?" she asked, which is what you ask when you cannot ask the real question because there is no answer for it. The girl shook her head. She thought of the hawk's wing against her cheek. She thought of the way straw pricks skin. She thought of blood, which is the same in princes and pig boys. "I prayed," Sansa said, as if confession could be offered in a garden to a stranger. "I don't know for what. I prayed for it all to stop and for it not to be my fault and for that to not be a wrong prayer. I prayed for—" She closed her mouth. "You're here." "I'm here," the girl said. It was the first time she had said anything true that day. The truth felt like the first swallow of cold water after walking too far in heat. Sansa looked at the basket. The girl looked at Sansa's hands. There was a shape between them already, a thing they would have to lift together if they were to move it at all. It had the size of a future. "You cannot stay," Sansa said, and her voice did not break. "Not here." "I know," the girl said. "I wanted—" She stopped. If she said "I wanted to see you," the words would fill the air, and the air would be full of something that would catch the light, and the guard would glance, and everything would be torn. She shifted the basket on her hip. The cap itched her hair. Sansa's eyes asked a question she could not ask and forgave the lack of answer before it came. "The gods keep you," she whispered instead, as if the gods had ever done anyone such a favor without charging for it. "Go." The girl leaned forward as if to set the basket at Sansa's feet. In that motion was 1,000 other motions. Gathering a smaller body in the dark when monsters and stories turn real, holding hands under a table while a raven cawed, snatching sweets from a tray and running laughing. Sansa's hands unfolded and then folded again. The girl straightened. They did not touch. Touching would have undone the careful world they had drawn. Lines on a parchment meant to look like a map. The guard shifted. A sparrow hopped. The quince tree offered a last leaf to the ground with the air of a gift rejected. The girl turned and went under the arch and became a servant again. She left the hill not by the refuse gate this time, but by a path that ran along the inside of the eastern wall where the wind cut like a knife sharpened on old stone. It smelled different there, the city's breath strong with salt and the rust of water against chain. She looked once toward the sea and saw sails spreading like wet wings on the horizon. Men would come because men always came when a crown fell, with arguments folded in their packs and armies trailing behind their last words. She tightened the knot on her satchel and went down toward the noise like a swimmer walking into a river. In Flea Bottom, a woman who knew too much about the city's twin appetites for rumor, and Stu put a bowl in front of her and patted her head like she might have patted a cat if cats permitted such nonsense. "You look as if your bones have been supporting you more than is decent," she said. "Eat, little ghost." The girl ate and tried to remember if that was a kindness. She decided it was. She paid with the coin she had thought to sew into her hem. The woman caught the flash of metal with a practiced glance, considered asking questions, and decided not to. She had seen too many children come with their hands full of stories and leave with empty hands and mouths that could not stop telling. Silence seemed a better trade. When night had folded over King's Landing like a cloak you might use to smother a fire and not quite succeed, the girl went to the river. Boats rocked, old hulls grumbled to mooring posts, water slapped with a soft hatred. She had the Bravosi coin tied in a strip of cloth at the base of her throat where it would ride against pulse and skin. The man who had given it to her had taught her a word in a language that wore knives under its syllables. She did not know if she would spend it now. The river could take you out and bring you back to the sea that has no walls and every wall. The road could take you north and north again until the air wrapped your lungs like snow. The city could take you down into itself until you forgot there had been an up. She stood on the quay where rope ends swung like dead snakes and said nothing. The bells had slept at last. Crickets wrote letters to one another and never sent them. Somewhere up on the hill, a woman who had been a queen sat very straight and did not blink because blinking would have let tears fall. Somewhere else a man counted old enemies and discovered new ones hiding between them like burrs in wool. Somewhere a boy not yet used to the idea of a throne laid 2 hands on a crown and tried to feel its temperature. The girl put her hand against her breast where the coin lay and thought of faces she had not yet taken revenge from, and of names that were still knotted on her string. She thought of the hawk's wing, the heat of leather, the sight of eyes that had not believed in death the way you believe in math and mourning. She thought of Sansa's hands that had known not to reach, and the warmth of that not reaching. A rat ran along the edge of the quay and paused to look at her with the open interest of a creature that does not waste time on shame. "Go on," she said to it once her throat trusted her, and it went as if it had always intended to. She turned from the water because the water had not yet decided what to do with her, and if she waited too long, she would be letting it choose. She walked back into the city with the step of someone who could pass for a shadow when she needed to and a child when shadows had no purchase. The night behind her made a sound like a deep breath and then closed its mouth. The story would tell itself many ways in the days to come. There would be drawings of an assassin with 7 fingers on each hand, and men swearing they had seen her hover above straw, and women saying it had been poison because they liked the elegance of poisons better than the blunt truth. There would be a sword taken from a king's guard and weighed and found wanting not because it was light or heavy but because it was implication. There would be a hunt that would snarl through the city, catching on scabs and tearing them, and there would be men hanged to quiet the crowd's uncertainty. There would be a boy crown that fit at last because it had to, and there would be roses on stone to sweeten a room that would otherwise have smelled unendurable. The girl would be in none of those places. She would be everywhere else. She would teach her feet new maps and her hands new knots. She would wear a dozen more names like shirts off washing lines until she knew which one could be kept. She would think of the north as you think of warmth when water closes over your head. Not as a thing you are in, but as a thing you are going toward because it must exist. She would add and subtract names on her string, as if reckoning for a merchant who had asked her to settle accounts with blood. She would put her palm to the river and decide if it was time. For now, she slept again in a room with a rope bed and bodies who did not belong to her, and when she woke she listened to the city decide what it had been last night. She ate what could be eaten. She saved what could be saved. She did not go back to the hill. Not yet. The hill had learned her. The hill would have to wait. When the sun came through the crack in the shutter the next morning, it cut the room diagonally and made a bright bone through darkness. Dust turned in it, busy, ignorant, shining because nothing yet had told it not to. The girl sat up and let the light fall across her fingers. They were scratches and callus and little red lines where straw had made its argument. She curled them once and then again. Hands that had killed a king looked like any hands. She laughed then, a small, ridiculous sound that surprised the woman on the next pallet into making a face as if anyone's laughter was an insult before breakfast. The girl put the laugh away with the coin and the names. She rose. There was work to do that had nothing to do with kings. There was always that work, and it made the world carryable. In the Red Keep, a boy crowned not by love but by necessity sat in a chair too old for him and tried to hide his knees with dignity. He had a mother at his shoulder who had found something new to harden, and an uncle whose scar reminded him that the world is fond of making marks, and a council full of men who spoke in turns like weather. He looked up once and saw a hawk on the window ledge, and because he was a boy he smiled, and because he was a new king the smile was a mistake. He learned it and forgot it and learned it again as boys do. He would become himself because time insisted. Varys put a small piece on the great board that no one else could see and watched how it cast shadows. Littlefinger rolled a coin over his knuckles, as men do who wish to be seen playing with small things while their minds are busy turning large wheels. Cersei watched them both and knew each had tucked away a story in which EW. As the author, she set her mouth and wrote in the air with her eyes the shape of a sentence that would cut those stories to pieces. Tyrion drank and did not get drunk because sometimes sobriety is a worse prison than wine but does a better job. Sansa sat at her window and stitched because women who have been told they are safest in rooms learn to make those rooms bear the imprint of their will. She made a line of thread accept its path. She put 2 tiny figures on a hill and made sure neither turned away. When she pricked her finger and a bead of blood came, bright as a berry, she did not suck it. She watched it swell, then pressed a cloth to it and lifted it and saw the mark left behind. She thought of a girl in a garden whose chin had lifted like a wolf. She thought of bells. She thought of snow. The girl who had been Arya walked under a line of laundry strung between 2 houses, shirts like surrender flags. Beyond them, beyond the cracked plaster and the raucous crows on the ridgepole and the quarrel below about a loaf that had more weevils than bread, the sea shone its dull, hard shine. She set her eyes toward a place she had not seen in years and knew by heart. She felt the city like a coat she could shrug off if she shook hard enough. She set her feet moving to find the place and the person who would take a coin and tell her the right word for the right boat. In a shadowed nook above a stair, her old stone waited behind the seam for fingers that would not come. It did not care. Stones do not measure time. It had held secrets before and would again. The mews smelled of clean straw and something else that men brought with them when they cleaned. The hawk had been moved to a quieter place where it could learn that men die and hawks do not care. On the straw where a boy had fallen on his knees, there was a patch lighter than the rest. Men had gathered and said things over it and gone away. The air remembered the words only as disturbance. There is a way a city holds its breath and then lets it out. King's Landing did that once, twice, 3 times in the next days. At the quays, boats came and left. At the September, candles burned down and were replaced. In alleys, cats fought and made the same obscene sound cats make anywhere. In the keep, a crown changed heads as if it were a hat that would adorn anything so long as it was at the correct height above the floor. Below, the girl did what a person who has cut their own path must do. She went forward along it without asking for it to be softened. At last, when the sun went down a color like old copper and the gulls were only scraps of movement she did not follow with her eyes, she stood again on the quay. The river was less hateful in that light. It made a place for boats to be simple. She felt in her throat under the cloth for the coin and pressed it flat to feel its bite on her skin. She did not speak the word yet. She would, but not yet. The north lay like a story told by a good voice, the kind you would walk a long way to hear. The sea lay like a dare. She measured both with the same cool patience she had learned in kitchens, cutting vegetables to a size that would please a mouth. She did not know which mouth she fed. She knew she held the knife. "Where to?" asked a voice behind her. The boatman's question that might have been intended for her or for someone standing nearby. She did not turn. She watched a strip of light break along a wave and go out. "Not here," she said, to the river, to herself, to the word she did not say. Then she gathered her cloak and went up from the water and into the streets whose ruts she had learned better than lines on a palm. And the city closed around her as a forest closes over a deer, making a shape and then not holding it, letting it go.